Next up on Afterwards, Ayn Rand fellow Don Watkins discusses income inequality with Diana Furchtgott-Roth of the Manhattan Institute.
Don, I have so much enjoyed reading your terrific book, Unequal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality. And it's so thought-provoking to read from someone who says that inequality is not a problem. Could you start out by telling us why inequality isn't a problem?
Well, sure. I mean, let's start out with what is economic inequality, because I think usually it's equated with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. But inequality just means a gap. And we can have a gap because some people are getting richer and others are getting poorer. But we can also have a gap because people are getting richer at different rates. Mm-hmm. And inequality can also rise or fall for different reasons. So one reason might be that some people are just being really, really productive. You have a Jeff Bezos at Amazon who's employing thousands of people, who's creating tons of value by pioneering some new invention. And so he's going to get much richer than me and, say, my wife, who's a teacher, right? And she is, I think, a great teacher, but she's only providing economic value to a few dozen people at a time. But on the other hand, there's also things that can increase inequality that are bad, that are unjust, that take advantage of people. So Bernie Madoff, right? He's a guy who's going to embezzle and steal a lot of money through fraud. So that can increase inequality. And so the reason I say inequality isn't a problem is that what we're concerned with is not how much money do you have, but how did you get it? Did you get it through something that was fair, or did you get it through a process that was unfair? And when you try to equalize people who earn their money honestly, that's something that we're challenging and saying that's not a fair way to treat people.
Right. Well, we hear often that the middle class is stagnating and that inequality is one of the causes. What do you say about that? What do you say to these people?
Well, I think you have to first be clear on why is it that the critics of inequality have made this such a central claim, this idea of middle class stagnation. And I think it's because Americans have a sense that we don't live in a zero-sum world, that when you achieve something through your work, it doesn't come at my expense. When Jeff Bezos builds Amazon, it didn't make me worse off, it made me better off. And so if you want to convey to people that no, we live in a zero-sum universe, and so to lift some up, we have to bring others down, which is really what the inequality campaign is all about. In order to do that, you have to be able to show that something to the effect that the guys at the top got there at your cost, by disadvantaging, by taking advantage of you. And that's really why this claim of stagnation has become central to them. And so the idea is that the middle class has stagnated since, they'll use different start dates, but generally 1979. Now I think this is wildly implausible just through common sense. That if you ask somebody, hey, would you rather be making $50,000 today or $100,000 in 1979? Given all the advances in medicine, given everything that's happened in the internet and computer technology realm, given just our bigger houses, and very few people would take that bet. And the question is then, well, what is this claim based on? And what it is it's based on claims that look at statistical aggregates. So it's the idea we're supposed to have in our minds is the idea of, I started working in 1979 and man, I have not gotten a raise for decades. But that's really not the scenario we're talking about. What we're talking about is a certain statistical category has seen its wages not increase very much over time. But statistical categories don't necessarily reflect what's happening to real life individuals like you and me. Just a couple brief examples. So for instance, to say that middle class incomes have stagnated over 40 years, the composition of who's being counted can change. And so we have, for instance, different trends in immigration. We've seen an influx of immigrants primarily from poorer countries, and they come here to the United States, and now they earn more than they did in their home country, so they're better off.
Right.
We are presumably unchanged. You know, that we are making whatever we were making before. And yet, what's going to happen to the median income when you get this influx of people taking low-paying jobs? It's going to go down, even though everybody is, on this scenario better off. Or you can take the fact that what these statistics look at is household income. But the composition of households has changed over time. In the 1970s, we saw a rise in divorce rates. And so if you have a couple making $50,000 a year, who, let's say, gets divorced, and even if they get a raise to, say, $35,000 a year, statistically, that makes us look worse off because now you have two households making 35 instead of one household making 50. So there's a lot of these factors that I think lead to the statistics that claim that we're stagnating, but if we just look around us and really take a careful look at those statistics, I don't think you can justify that claim.
So if equal is unfair, is there any role at all for taxation? Should there be any taxation at all to help people at the bottom?
I think the question we have to ask is, what do we need government for? Because we need a government, no question about that. I'm certainly not an anarchist, but the reason we need a government is, so think about go back before the Founding Fathers. The basic setup of the government was unequal. Was some people are born the rulers, and some people are born the ruled. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to rise in life, you had to get the favor of somebody who was one of the rulers.
Right, but before the Founding Fathers, life was nasty, brutish, and short, according to Thomas Hobbes.
Exactly, and that's one of the consequences.
We don't want to go back to those days, do we?
No, exactly not. But my point is this. That's the ultimate rigged system. It's when you have these entrenched, unequal, politically unequal groups. Mm-hmm. The real insight of the Enlightenment thinkers like the founders was each of us is equal in the fact that we have equal rights. And so the government's job is not to rule us, it's to be our servant, the protector of our rights. But what happens when it protects our rights equally? What happens when it protects your freedom the same that it protects mine? We're going to create very different amounts of wealth because we have different abilities, we make different choices, some of us want to go and become a teacher. Mm-hmm. And for us, that's what a successful life is. Whether we, go up from where our parents were or down from where our parents were, that's what a successful life is. Other people want to be hedge fund managers. Other people want to start new companies. You're going to get inequality if we have equal freedom.
Right, yes. But what if the people who want to start hedge funds cannot do that because, say, they have a poor education? Do you think that government has any role in making their opportunities more equal by making sure that they have a better education, for example?
No, I absolutely not. And I realized I skipped the important essence of your previous question, which is does the government have a role to help out here? Mm-hmm. So let's start with this idea of equality of opportunity. I think it's been a mistake to talk about equality of opportunity because you can mean one of two things. One of them, very, very good. One of them, very, very bad. One of them is a level playing field. That is, we all play by the same rules. And that's what that political equality I was talking about a moment ago means. It means your freedom is protected equally to my freedom. But the way that phrase has been used, especially in the last 70 years or so, is to mean equality of initial chances of success.
Yeah.
It means the fact that if you're born to parents who are a little richer, or if they give you a good education, or as one egalitarian philosopher said, if they did something so monstrous as to read to you, mm-hmm. you're going to have unfair advantages. Now, it's true, we have unequal opportunities. There's no way to change that. But one important fact needs to be kept in mind at all times. One person's opportunities don't come at anybody's expense. The fact is, take the example of Bill Gates. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a really popular book a few years ago in which he pointed out that, hey, we give Bill Gates all this credit for succeeding.
Yes, I read that book too.
But he went to school that had computers when nobody else's school had computers.
It wasn't just that he went to school where no one else had computers, but he got up in the middle of the night. He snuck off to college, programmed computers.
That's exactly right.
And then came back to bed. And his mother was wondering why he was always so hard to wake up in the morning. Yeah,
and that's exactly right. And that highlights two things. First of all, would we have been better off if Bill Gates didn't have access to those computers? No, we'd be way worse off. Opportunities would have been more equal, but everybody would have been a loser. Then the second point is precisely that. A lot of what matters in life is not the opportunities you have, but what you do with the ones that you have. A lot of our success in life is really about turning things that don't look like opportunities into opportunities. Just one quick example. We tell a story in the book. Susan Peterson had been a guest on the show Shark Tank, which great show. And she had a business making these little stylish baby moccasins for little kids to wear. And she had started with this talent, but she couldn't turn it into a business because she didn't have any money. So did she complain about not having equal opportunities? No, what she did is she asked her brother, who had a window business, if she could follow him around for the summer, keep the discarded window frames. And so she's following him around, banging out the glass, and at the end of the summer turned in the aluminum for $200, and that's how she started her business, and now it's successful. Now, if you had asked, oh, does she have any opportunities? Just in the abstract, you would say, oh, no, she doesn't have any money. But because she set a goal for herself and she took the responsibility for achieving it, she was able to see something that was an opportunity, a potential opportunity, and then act to turn it into success. And I think that's what you want to see. Stop resenting other people's opportunities and look around at all the ones that are open to you.
Yeah.
But then just to highlight, no, I think the reason that you can't have the government promote one person's opportunities is the only way it can do it is at other people's expense. So the number one thing I'd like to see is that the government stop taking away people's opportunities, which I think it does way too much of. And hopefully we'll get to talk more about these. But if you just take things like the minimum wage, which now in California where I live, they're going to hike up to $15 an hour over the next few years. Occupational licensing laws, an education system that leaves too many Americans, particularly poor Americans, without a good education. These are really the things holding people back. It's not that they haven't gotten big enough handouts. It's that they've gotten handicapped by government intervention.
Exactly. I mean, with these increases in the minimum wage, then low-skilled people cannot get any jobs at all. And it's very troubling that this is spreading across the country. New York State might be the next, just in the name of getting rid of inequality.
Yeah, and so there's a big debate in the literature, as you know, about one side says the minimum wage creates unemployment. The other side says, no, if we look at the studies, they don't. I think we can think about this in a much more simple way, which is this. If I can't find somebody willing to offer me $15 an hour to work, the minimum wage says it's illegal for me to work.
Right.
So I come at this book and this issue from the perspective of philosophy. And in particular, one of the things philosophy is very concerned with is justice. And so I would say, even if it were true that 99% of the people get a higher wage and only 1% of the people get stopped from working by something like the minimum wage, that is unjust. You can't prop up some people by obliterating the futures of other people who are unable to take that first step on the road to success.
Well, academic economists conclude that it's just the young and unskilled that are hurt by these increases in the minimum wage. So it's really those who we are preventing from getting their foot on the first rung of the career ladder. So it is very troubling that in California and perhaps in New York, teenagers aren't going to be able to get jobs because of this step.
No, I think it's really sad and really tragic, and it ignores that the main thing that people need to succeed, and this is really the story of American history, is an open road to success. Go back before we had a welfare state, before the government was doing anything to try to lift people up. Here was a time when human beings had only had economic progress for a relatively short amount of time, and yet people were able to come here and build successful lives for themselves because here, as opposed to their home countries, nobody was going to stop you from doing what you judged best for your life. And I think the same thing is true here. The more that we open the road to productive achievement and stop putting blockades and barriers in the way of it, that's what really is going to allow everybody, regardless of where they start, to have the maximum opportunity to really achieve success and happiness.
Yes, yes. Well, you say in your book, quote, that no one can exploit you with voluntary trade, but there are always charlatans who prey on the uninformed. Look at buyers of VW diesel cars, for example, who thought that they were buying low-emissions vehicles. Do you think there's any role for the government, such as the Federal Trade Commission, to make sure that what people are saying is true? Or do you think there's any role for laws that say children under some age, such as 15 or 12, shouldn't be allowed to work to avoid exploitation?
So I think the essence of a moral society, when it comes right down to it, is that it's voluntary, that we interact voluntarily, that basically we reach a mutual agreement or we're free to go our separate ways. But nobody can do something to us without our consent. And so the question is, in cases where somebody sells you a product that's different than what they promised you, that's exactly where we need a government to step in and say, hey, that's not what that person consented to. When he agreed to pay $20,000 for that car, it was a car that was going to operate in a certain way. I don't think you need regulatory bodies. I think you just need laws against theft, fraud, and so on. Because what regulatory bodies do is basically they don't prescribe criminal behavior, they prescribe and proscribe productive behavior. They dictate how people produce, and they decide what kind of deal can we arrive at. It's not, regulation to tell car makers when you sell somebody something, it better be what you told them it was. It is a regulation when they say your car has to get this kind of gas mileage, and it has to have this many seat belts, and it has to do X, Y, Z, rather than leaving that up to the mutual choice of buyers and sellers. As far as children, I think the government has a right or a responsibility to protect the rights of children, but I don't think that applies in so-called child labor laws, which I actually think are, on the whole, pretty damaging. Because they're on the one hand, they're unnecessary when you're really concerned with the well-being of a child. Because parents, we're so rich now that parents aren't going to send their kids into a coal mine. The first thing parents do once they achieve a certain level of economic success is they send their kids to school. And that's why you saw child labor going away before there were ever laws against child labor. It was on its way out because of economic progress. But those laws actually make it much harder for kids who are excited. They would, instead of playing Nintendo or whatever, the video game system is, they would love to have a job where they can earn money, gain responsibility. And you know who suffers most from those laws? The poor kids. One of my best friends, who I write about in the book, Jeremiah, he was basically thrown into the foster care system at a pretty young age.
Yeah.
And the main thing that he didn't have was his own money, so he could actually feed himself, so that he could gain a foothold and start building a resume and achieving success. And this is one of the barriers, that it's, until you hit some arbitrary age deemed by the government, you're allowed to go out there and waste your life or hang out on the street corner or, do any kind of unproductive thing you want. But the one thing you can't do is be productive. And I think that is unfair to young people.
Don't you think there should be a law saying children, say under a certain age, have to be in school? What if, I know that it's not very common, but what if there were parents who would say, look, I'm going to send my children out to, wash cars all day because our family needs the money, or something like that? Shouldn't that be prohibited?
I think you need to have the government define what do we consider actual abuse of children. But after that, it has to be up to the parent's judgment, because that brings you down a very dangerous road for a number of reasons. But the basic one is now the government gets to decide what qualifies as an education. And I think that's one of the worst things you can do. We're so worried about putting the government in charge of our healthcare decisions, which I agree. That's a scary thing. Yeah. But putting them in charge of the ideas and values that children are taught, we've taken that for granted for over 100+ years. So I think the biggest risk is not that a handful of parents won't send their kids to school. I think the biggest risk is that schools are taken over by bureaucracy rather than opened up for choice, for parents being free to decide what ideas their children should be taught, and for innovators to come in and find exciting, effective new ways to educate children. Because the problem with government schooling today is it doesn't educate many, many children, particularly those growing up in the poorest neighborhoods.
Right, yes, yes. Well, one of the topics that's on most people's radar is the presidential elections, and it's been really interesting to see how much support Bernie Sanders has with his talk of inequality. And it's really driven his numbers much higher than they would have been otherwise. Can you talk about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, this gets us to really what is really going on in today's debate. Is it that Bernie Sanders just has tons of charisma and sex appeal, or is it that he actually has some ideas that have a lot of power? And I think it really is the power of the ideas. And it really comes from two things. Number one is he's standing up for a moral ideal, this ideal of economic equality. And the second is that he has on his side what you can call a moral narrative that tells us when you abide by my ideal, you flourish, and when you abandon the ideal, you flounder. And this, you've no doubt heard, is the idea that America really reached its zenith, its golden age, in the post-war era, when the government supposedly fought income inequality and we all did better. And then what happened in the 70s, which is oddly usually equated with blaming Reagan, but starting in the 70s, what happened is we abandoned that ideal. The 1% took over, started rigging the game. We moved in a radical free market direction, and the result is, they got all the gains and we all stagnated. And so the lesson is supposed to be fight inequality, things are great, abandon inequality, things are bad. And so
and his message does have some traction. I mean, it's been
Yes.
getting a lot of traction. He goes out there, he says taxes should go up to 80, 90%, and people cheer, college students vote for him.
yeah, and
They feel the burn.
Yeah, so I think it's when you have morality on your side, at least when you appear to have a moral ideal on your side, that's very inspiring, particularly to young people.
Yeah, they see that they think he's telling the truth, that it's coming from his heart. They see him as authentic.
Yeah, and well, I think...
How do we fight that message, or how do we address it?
I actually think what's going on is two aspects. One is that that he has this moral ideal. Take the issue of free college. Oh, he's going to help out people by giving them all college. But it also appeals to greed for the unearned, because the message that a lot of these kids take away is also, hey, maybe I'll get out of these college loans. And when you combine greed for the unearned and a moral ideal, people will crusade for something, and the only way to oppose that is to challenge the ideal. So long as you grant that, yeah, free college, that makes you a good person, then they can come out and take that strong stand for it. But if all they're doing is coming out and saying, in effect, hey, I want a bailout or a handout, you're not going to see that crusading spirit. But the thing that's happened, and this is, I think, what's really tragic about this whole discussion, is that the critics of inequality, people who don't want to see the government expanding how much wealth it takes from people, expanding how much control it has over people's choices, the people who support free enterprise and free markets, they have not really had much to say in this issue. When we started writing our book, you know how many books the left had put out on this issue? Probably 4 or 5 a year.
Yeah.
How many have the opponents of the inequality critics put out at that time? Zero. And one of the biggest issues already 2 years ago. Since then, there's been 2 books. One by a Canadian professor not too many people have heard of, unfortunately, even though his book was quite good. And then another by Thomas Sowell, which was, it had some good elements, but it only addressed a small subcomponent of the debate. It didn't address the whole thing. When we do see the debate addressed, it focuses either on just challenging the statistics and saying inequality is not as bad as you think, or challenging the solutions, saying we agree we should minimize inequality, but if you remember Rand Paul during the presidential debates, Republicans will reduce inequality better than Democrats. And the trouble is, both of those concede that economic equality is an ideal. And the problem is, if economic equality is an ideal, then we're in trouble, because economic freedom is immoral. Because as we talked about with Bezos versus my wife, a free market leads to nothing resembling economic inequality. It leads to progress for everybody, but very different progress. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to challenge their ideal, we have to challenge their narrative, and we have to present a counter-ideal and counter-narrative, and that's really what we do in the book.
Right, yes. Well, I certainly very, very much enjoyed reading it, and it's certainly very much worth everybody picking up and adding it to the debate. What seems to concern many Americans isn't inequality per se, but mobility. So we talk about people who start off low and they just want to get better off. And that seems to be more important than economic inequality. What do you say about that?
I definitely think that that's true, that a lot of our concern when it comes to fairness is not that gap. It's that are people able to rise by merit? Are they able to rise by their own efforts, even if they start out without, a lot of wealth, without all of the things that people on the more affluent side of the scale have? I think there's a couple things that are important to keep in mind about mobility. First of all, mobility has not declined. Most researchers agree mobility in America has not really declined over the last 40 years, even as economic inequality has probably been rising. But we do have a mobility problem. Now, the danger is thinking about mobility in purely financial terms. A lot of times you'll see these charts. How many people move up from the bottom quintile into the top quintile, or until the middle? I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because the goal in life is not to move up to a particular quintile. It's to find a career you're happy at, you can be self-supporting at, and build for yourself a really fulfilling life. So I mentioned my friend Jeremiah. Here's a guy who started at the bottom and now is a teacher. Now, I don't know exactly how much money he makes, but I imagine most teachers probably don't make enough to get into the top 10% or top 20% of earners. But isn't that a full success? Should we regret that he didn't go and become an investment banker? Because that might have he's smart enough to, that would have gotten him to the top.
Well, there are people who say we need to pay teachers more, and that their level that they're giving back to society doesn't really square with the amount that we're paying them, that we should be paying teachers more.
Well,
and in fact, Joel Klein, in his program for New York, had proposals where the teachers would get paid more in exchange for giving up tenure as teachers.
That's funny.
But the union wouldn't let that happen.
Well, that's quite revealing of the unions. No, I mean, I think that teachers should be paid as much economic value as they can generate on a market. The problem is we don't have a market for education today, and so it's not clear what teachers should be paid in the sense of how much economic value are they really adding. But the basic question is then, how should we think about mobility if we shouldn't think about it by looking at these mobility tables? And I think the way you think about it is, are there barriers preventing a person from rising? Are there barriers stopping a person from rising? And I think what that really comes down to at the end of the day is government intervening in the economy in the way that prevents a person from rising by productive achievement, from rising by productive merit.
Well, there are so many. I mean, there's, for example, occupational licensing, which you discuss in your book.
Yeah, and let me give one example of that. There's a million examples, and maybe there's some that particularly annoy you, but here's the one that particularly annoys me. Let's say I can't find anybody to employ me, and so I think I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to teach or perform hair braiding because it's a skill I'm really good at. And let's say I know a bunch of people who want to pay me to do it. In many states, I can't do that. It's illegal for me to do that until I get a license from the state, which can cost.
It's illegal for me to braid your hair?
Yeah, absolutely.
I cannot believe it.
I'm sure we could do it as
braiding.
friends, but as a job, as a trade, I have to go and spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours getting a license, and hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars. Now, who are the people most likely to try to become hair braiders, and who are the people least likely to be able to afford to go through a process like that? It is precisely the poorest people who need every ounce of freedom to really get that step on the road to success. And that's just one of many, many examples.
Yeah, they were even closing down children's lemonade stands in some states.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, a lot of a lemonade stand is about teaching the lessons of entrepreneurship. I think that teaches one of the main lessons of entrepreneurship today, which is that you need permission from the government to do almost anything. Right. But it really is outrageous. But there are so many barriers, particularly for people starting out from the bottom. We talked about the minimum wage. We talked about education. Here's one more kind of area. Everything the government does that drives up cost of the things that we buy is a huge barrier and opportunity, because it means I have to work that much harder just to make a living. So when the government funds a, quote, affordable housing crusade, a lot of what it's doing is driving up the cost of housing as more people are demanding housing. A lot of the restrictions that we see by the EPA on energy production, such as the whole ethanol scandal, such as it is, that drives up the cost of energy. Who are the people who are most affected by that? The people who don't have that big a budget and can't afford these higher energy costs.
Right, the bottom fifth spends 25% of its income on energy and gasoline and motor oil, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Yeah,
and the top fifth spends 4%.
Yeah, and think a fourth of a tight budget, that's a really big deal. So there are all these little ways in which rising is becoming harder. And so if we're really concerned with people's ability to rise by merit, your first obligation is to stop making it harder for them.
So what do you say to people who say that we need to have more renewable energy, solar and wind, even though it drives up the cost of energy, because that helps the planet? Don't you want to help the planet?
No, this is a big question, but I would say what I want to do is help human beings. I want to help human lives, and the way that you do that fundamentally is leave people free to use the best energy for their own lives. Let them decide whether it's oil, natural gas, nuclear,
well, they probably all choose coal and
hydroelectric.
natural gas because that was the cheapest.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Then other people are going to come and say, but this is polluting, this is increasing greenhouse gas emissions, this is causing global warming or climate change. What do you say to them?
Let's see, how do we sum that up in a few sentences? What I would say is this, if we actually look at the big picture pluses and minuses of the use of fossil fuels, it is, I think, without a question, on net, hugely beneficial to human beings. If we want to understand how human beings went from living from 30 until living to 80, it's been precisely because we've had cheap, affordable, abundant energy. And I don't think that the arguments we hear against fossil fuels actually hold up. I don't think that, you know, the idea that we're running out of them, that we need the government to get us hooked on something else is true. I think they can certainly cause pollution, and that's why you need laws to protect us from pollution, but you don't need to outlaw the fuel that more than 80% of the time is making possible industrial civilization. Climate change is I think, a more complex issue. I don't think there's evidence that we're headed for a climate catastrophe. I think the planet has been warming, and I think on net, what fossil fuels do is give us the ability to cope with any climate. So I think, but to circle and connect this then to the whole inequality debate, one of the major things that we're told is that we need to expand the power of government in order to equalize people economically, and then we're told we need to expand the power of government in order to prevent us from destroying the planet for fossil fuels. But no matter what it is, it's always take away freedom and wealth from individuals and give more power to the government. And these have really become the two major arguments, the environmental argument and the inequality argument, for expanding the government today. And so we're tackling the inequality argument here. I should just add, a close friend of mine wrote a book tackling the environmental one called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. So, let's see. I would say we've got the problem solved now. Two books, one on each issue.
Right. We just have to make sure people read them and take them to heart.
That is the hard part.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people talk about Scandinavia as the ideal, and they say we should be more like Scandinavia because Scandinavia is more equal. What do you say about that?
This is one of the funny things. When I started writing this book, I knew a little about Scandinavia, but not a lot. And actually, I work with a colleague who's from Sweden. And one of the surprising things I found was that actually, if you look at the history of, say, Sweden, what you find is that it supports the complete opposite conclusion from what we're usually taught.
Really? Why is that?
So a lot of what we hear comparisons between Sweden and America today. I think those comparisons are dangerous for many reasons. One, there's a bunch different than just our political policies. Number two, it's easy to cherry pick the political policies that you want to say characterize Sweden versus America. We're often told that Sweden is the socialist country and America is a crazy, capitalist country. In fact, we're pretty much comparable in the amount of government control there is, government involvement in the economy. It's just different. They have a little bit, their regulatory scheme. Much higher taxes, much more wealth redistribution, but actually much less damaging regulatory sphere in many ways than America. So they're about comparable in that sense. But this is what's really fascinating. The history of Sweden. So Sweden actually started off as one of the most poor countries in Europe. If you go back a few hundred years ago, one of the poorest countries in Europe. It then quickly became one of the richest countries in Europe, and it was because it became one of the most free market countries. I think you could probably make an argument that in many ways it was more free market for many years than the United States. Became very rich, very unequal, very unequal. In I think roughly the 1960s is when you start to get Sweden, as we hear it talked about today, where it moved in the direction of dramatically increasing taxes, dramatically increasing wealth redistribution. It was never a socialist country, but it was a pretty, it went very far in the direction of a social democratic redistributive state.
Yes.
The result was that the economy basically flatlined. Things got really bad. You didn't see the economic growth. You didn't see the entrepreneurial verve that had been in Sweden at that point. You weren't getting like a ton of new companies coming out all the time. What happened in economic inequality? Well, it shrank. In fact, it got as low as it's ever gotten then. Well, eventually the Swedes said, this is not working, and in more recent years have started again kind of liberating their economy, and they've seen really, really good economic outcomes. But what's happened to economic inequality? Well, it's starting to grow again. Yeah. So I think if you look at it from the perspective of their own history, you see at least a testament to the kind of case we're making, that if you're concerned about economic progress, what you want is not economic redistribution, but economic liberation.
We do want some redistribution, right? We do need some things done. For example, we need armies, we need street lights, we need certain things that only the government can pay for. And so because of that, we need to have taxes.
Well, but I think you need to differentiate between two things. One is we need to pay for the things that the government does that protect all of our freedoms. And I mean, particularly the military, the police. There's no question about that. And you can debate about what are the best ways to raise that revenue. But I don't call that redistribution. Redistribution is when the government, instead of raising funds in order to protect everybody's freedom and property, basically takes some people's property so they can give it to other people. And there, I think there's never a justification for that.
So there shouldn't be any government social safety net, no earned income tax credit, no food stamps, no unemployment insurance, no housing vouchers, no Medicaid?
No forcing one person to work without pay so that other people can get paid without working. Now,
they don't work without pay. They get paid, but a portion of it goes for the social safety net. So if they then get in trouble, then they have that social safety net to fall back on.
No, I mean, I call that working without pay, because what it really amounts to is I went to work and somebody wants to pay me in return for my services, and I don't get to decide what to do with that money. That goes to some other cause that I may not agree with, I may not want it, I may not want it in that amount. I'm not against a safety net, if you want to call it that. Bad things can happen in life and you have to be prepared for them, right? Bad things can happen to the people you care about and you want to do something about it.
Right.
But all of that can be taken care of voluntarily. My previous book, Roosevelt Care, focused on America before and after the welfare state. And one of the things that was happening in America before the creation of the welfare state, really starting in 1935 with the Social Security Act, was that there were these challenges involved in industrialization where suddenly you had to figure out, well, what happens if I lose a job? Or now that we're living longer, what do I do in retirement to take care of myself and to take care of my family? And what was happening is people were starting to find private voluntary solutions to these. First of all, they would just save, a much more significant amount of money than we do today. But there was also rising insurance in terms of unemployment insurance, although that was often illegal for some bizarre reason in the States. But private unemployment insurance, there was a phenomenon called mutual aid societies, which were in effect little insurance agencies where I could join one of these Elks Lodges or Moose Lodges, pay an amount that I agreed to, and then have a contractual right to, say, health care benefits, or in some cases, a place to stay if I was elderly and couldn't support myself. And then, of course, there was abundant private charity. Now, why should we make a social safety net, if you want to call it that, voluntary rather than coercive? Well, it's because different people have different values. My dad and I...
What about the food lines in the Great Depression? I mean, these things probably worked for some people some of the time, but we've all seen photographs of people standing in line for soup at the soup kitchen during the Great Depression. Are you saying that life was better then? And that not having food stamps is an advantage?
Wouldn't you be shocked if I said, yes, that was actually the ideal?
Well,
no,
I'm just interested in your answer.
No, absolutely. No, the fact is that the Depression was, economists debate the details, but there's no question that this was fundamentally made possible by government control over the economy, and particularly the actions of the Federal Reserve. And so when people are left free, you don't get widespread depressions.
Right. That is definitely agreed on. But one can say on the one hand that there should be less regulation and that the government should have, the Federal Reserve should have a consistent monetary policy tied to, say, the Taylor rule, without at the same time saying that there shouldn't be any social safety net. They don't both have to go together.
No, but my only point is this. If you recognize that wealth redistribution is immoral and destructive, the question is, but don't we need it? And what I'm saying is that, no, history actually shows we don't need it. And the Great Depression, far from being an example of, well, look what happened, what would have happened if we didn't have one, really, it doesn't count as an example, because the Great Depression is precisely the fact that we did have all these government interventions in the economy. And so if you keep the government out of things so that it doesn't create widespread depressions, then private voluntary charity has always been more than abundant. And then, of course, we're so much richer now that this is way less of a concern. The fact is that there's way more money that you can use to buy insurance, to help people that you care about, to help the causes you care about. So I don't see that as a problem. What I do see as a problem is a society that treats people not as individuals that we owe respect for their freedom and property to, but who divides society into resources and to burdens. We're burdens when we need handouts. We're resources to be exploited by society when we've achieved something. I don't think that's the way a moral society treats people. I think the way that people deserve to be treated is as independent beings who have a right to be left alone to pursue their own happiness and success.
And if they fall on hard times, if they're sick, if they fall down in the street of a heart attack, we don't have any obligation to help them get on their feet. We don't have any obligation to give them medical care. If they're starving, we don't have any obligation to give them food.
Well, you're saying we. The question is, who's the we?
Society as a whole.
Well, there is no society as a whole. There's only individuals. And so the question is, you have to ask which individuals have which responsibilities. If it's my friend or even somebody that I know around the neighborhood and I see that like their house burned down, yeah, I think I have a certain kind of obligation. It's part of having integrity is the people I care about, when the chips are down, I'm going to be there and assist them.
But say there's someone who's very nasty and perhaps a Republican and doesn't have any friends at all, and that person just has problems and there's no friend to bail them out. Are you saying that there's no government entity that has a moral obligation to bail them out?
No, that's one reason why you shouldn't be a jerk, because if you actually want people to help you and people to be nice to you, you actually have to be a traitor. You have to repay the favor. But I'm against the idea that one person's need is an entitlement. When we think about this question, we often think about ourselves as the one doing the helping, right? And we think, yeah, I want to help people. I would hate seeing somebody starving in front of my eyes. So would I. But that's not the issue. You can help anybody that you want in a free society, and historically we've seen that people do. The question is this: put yourself in the shoes of somebody who needs help. Let's say you're sick, you need an operation you can't afford. Right. How would you think about the issue? Would you think, I'm entitled and somebody owes me, and I don't care if they're struggling to send their kid to school. I don't care if they're trying to build their business. I need something, and so you know what? I'm going to march over to my neighbor's house and I'm going to demand that he pay for my operation. I've asked thousands of people that question. I've yet to meet one person who goes, yeah, that's how I'd act. The way that we would act as civilized people is to ask and to understand that if they said no, all right, I'll go ask somewhere else. And I think that same kind of civilized moral attitude should be reflected in government policy. This isn't about helping people. This is about, is your need, your sheer need, entitlement, regardless of why you got into that position. And I never heard an argument for why it is an entitlement.
Well, if you ask, say you need something like, to take the sake of argument, heart surgery, and you go to your friend and you say, I need heart surgery, would you give me the money for heart surgery? Your friend might want to give you the money, but not be able to afford the magnitude of that operation, that surgery. But if we pooled the risk, so to speak, by taking a few pennies from everybody, depending on their income, so that when you needed your heart surgery, there would be pennies from many, many people to help you with the heart surgery, and there would be a fund, a risk pool, so that you wouldn't have to depend on one friend. And you would have to have a rich friend who would be able to help you with that heart surgery. So these are questions where there are vast economies of scale, and where you might say that the government has a role to play in enabling these things to happen as a safety net.
Well, but this is one of the reasons why insurance is such a great innovation, right? Is we can get those economies of scale, but we get them voluntarily. And this is why that's so important, because we can decide if it's worth it to us. Now, the problem today, healthcare is a complex situation because it is so controlled by government that we take for granted that things would be as expensive as they are, that insurance would be as expensive as it is. We have a whole section in the book where we talk about some of the ways where government intervention has really made healthcare in America a combination of really, really good, that is, we see a lot of innovation, a lot of progress, and really, really bad. And one of the ways it's made it bad is it's driven up costs enormously precisely because it hasn't left the market free.
No, that's true. We have very, very severe problems in the delivery of our healthcare system just because of the lack of competition and the lack of the ability to get a bare bones health insurance. But it doesn't mean that it always works for everybody, and I would contend that we need some kind of safety net, because we don't want a society where if someone doesn't have any friends, they're starving or dying of an early death. And it's very troubling to me that you don't see the need for that.
Well, I think history shows that there isn't a need for that. The kind of scenario you're talking about is not really a realistic scenario, that in a rich land where people feel benevolently to one another, that there's somebody out there that is not going to have any friends, family, neighbors, no private charity willing to help them out. The idea that is really the scenario we're talking about, I think, doesn't make a lot of sense. But I want to separate two things. I think it would be great if today we were debating, should the government have any role in a safety net? I think that's a good debate to have. Mm-hmm. I think that's very different from debating economic inequality. The economic inequality debate focuses not on what happens to that 1 in a million person, or maybe less, who just can't help himself and doesn't have anybody willing to voluntarily help him. What it says is that we need to equalize, and at the core of that is the idea that we need to bring down people at the top as an end in itself. So it's not about solving problems with poor people. Let me give you one example. Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital in the 21st Century, his chief proposals for fighting inequality are marginal tax rates of upwards of 80%.
Is a global wealth tax.
And a global wealth tax of upwards of 10%. And also an inheritance tax upwards of 80%. And he says explicitly, he says, this is not about raising money to help the poor, because he argues these high taxes never raise that much in revenue. This is about ending those big fortunes. Now, I submit that that is very different. It's in a completely morally different category, and it's a different kind of debate than a debate over what do we do about that very exceptional case of a person who's in need and is having trouble finding support. That even if a person disagrees with me and says we need some kind of a safety net, I think they can see that there's something morally corrupt if your view is leading you to destroy fortunes as an end in itself, even though by your own admission it's not going to help that poor person.
Right, and Thomas Piketty is just completely very, very, very impractical, because it's very difficult to calculate wealth. Wealth changes every minute with markets changing and values changing, so implementing a wealth tax is extraordinarily difficult, which is why governments rely on income taxes. But there has been a lot of animosity, as you say, towards some people who earn a lot of money, such as CEOs, and the government's trying to rein in CEO pay in some different areas. Interestingly enough, there's been a lot less animosity towards rock stars such as Madonna and Lady Gaga, and also leading sports players. The animosity of the progressives seems to be targeted at CEOs rather than artists and sports players who people seem to think have earned the money that they get. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think part of the reason is that it's very easy to see the value of what a LeBron James does. Like, we can see, hey, he's a spectacular player and people love watching basketball. One of the really weird things about the debate over CEO pay is that we're taught to have really strong opinions about how much a CEO should get paid, but if you ask most people, what does a CEO do? I have yet to get a decent answer from most people.
Well, they manage companies.
Yeah, but people have no clue what that means or why it's important. And I mean, obviously, the people that we know who are experts and study this stuff, they have some idea of it. But it's not well known, and yet we're supposed to have a view of how much they should get paid. The Fortune 500, biggest companies in America, between $2 and $200 billion in revenue. You know what the average pay for the average CEO is? $10.5 million. Yeah. That's a lot of money. It's not nothing to scoff at. Right. I'd be happy to take a percent of that. Nevertheless, when you compare it to the scale of the companies that they're running, or you compare it to what LeBron James makes. LeBron James made it something like $20x million last year as his basketball salary. It does not seem particularly outrageous that CEOs of these companies are making that amount of money, particularly not when you look at how important their job is and how hard it is. Everything around us, the TV camera is a building with air conditioning and heating, the fact that we got here in a car, the fact that I got to this side of the country on an airplane, all of that was made by entrepreneurs, managers, by businesses, and all those businesses were headed by CEOs. And as we've seen, just an obvious case, Apple with and without Steve Jobs, it's clear a CEO can make a huge difference there.
Yeah, no, that's true. So you think it's because people understand basketball, they understand Madonna, they just don't understand the CEO. It's not, do you think that they have an animosity towards business? I was thinking that they have an animosity towards business.
It's both. So it's the lack of knowledge, but we are taught to be suspicious of business in general. If I was going to boil down to what our book is really about at the end of the day, it's a celebration of productive achievement. And one of the biggest disgraces and one of the worst injustices in history is that superlative businessmen, what's the most famous term associated with the businessmen of the 19th century? Robber barons. The idea that they robbed people.
Right.
What transformed this country from a country that was, basically a swamp backwater, it was totally poor, into, by 1914, the richest country in the world? It was in large part the actions of people like Carnegie and Rockefeller. It was the people who really created these new industries, these new modes of organization. And far from robbing people, if you look at the price of steel or the price of oil, as Rockefeller and as Carnegie are getting richer, the cost of what they're producing is going down, 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 right, as they supply a nation with kerosene and later gasoline, and as they supply a nation with steel. And today in our own time, we've seen a real smearing of any businessman who's successful. Even Steve Jobs, who I think he's also seen as an artist, so I think there's a more positive response. Within weeks of his death, you started hearing people going, "Oh, but he didn't give a lot to charity."
You did hear that. That's true.
This is a person who had created an amazing company that made millions of people's lives better, that had really also helped lift the standards of other companies who started thinking about the user experience at a better level. And yet, because he didn't give away the money that he earned, he was villainized.
Right.
Terribly unfair.
Exactly, yes, yes. Well, what message do you want people to take from your book?
This is the main message. So the debate about inequality is really a debate about what's happened to the American dream and how do we revive it. And I think one side in this debate has really focused on blaming it on the, quote, rich, which really means blaming it on the most productive Americans. And it means seeing the solution as penalizing and vilifying the rich, which means penalizing and vilifying the most successful Americans. And what we say is that, no, the cause of our problems, and we do have problems, is injustice against producers on every level of ability. And so if you wanted to boil down to our solution in a sentence, it's that the way to move us in a better direction and revive the American dream is to liberate productive ability and to celebrate productive achievement.
Yeah, yes. And what are your main recommendations for doing so, for expanding the economy and for having more economic growth? What do you think our presidential candidates should be saying right now in terms of how to get us out of the stagflation?
Oh my gosh. Well, I would say a couple things that we could do, some controversial, maybe some a little less controversial, is, first of all, let's end all of this corporate welfare. Let businesses compete in a free market. No subsidies, no bailouts, no special loans. Let businesses have to prove themselves in an actual free enterprise situation. I would say also let's stop putting barriers in the way of people rising, particularly people starting at the bottom. Let's get rid of the minimum wage so that people are free to find jobs. Let's get rid of the kind of insanely unnecessary occupational licensing situations such as the hair braiding that we've talked about. Let's stop the government from making things so expensive through completely unnecessary and ineffective things such as the ethanol subsidies and so on. Let's make it as easy as possible and the road as open as possible for people to start rising. I would say, in terms of education, I would like us to see us move in the direction of liberating education. I think what's happening in Nevada, where parents are giving more control and more choice with regards to education, is a good sign. I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like to see a bunch of innovators in the educational sphere running to Nevada so that we can really see education become cheaper and more effective for all Americans. And then finally...
And did you see what happened in Louisiana when the governorship changed? Children were not allowed to opt out of the C schools anymore. They could only opt out of the D and the F schools, whereas before they'd been allowed to opt out of the C, D, and F schools. And then when the Democratic governor came in place, he said they couldn't opt out of the C school because it was okay for them to be in a C school.
Well, I mean, that's the egalitarian creed. I mean, the egalitarian creed is not concerned with you making the most of your life. It's concerned with everybody making about the same of their lives. So, for instance, one of the things that, I mean, I take this debate personally. I do okay. My family does pretty well. And I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. And basically, the view of the inequality critics is that when I try to give them more opportunities, I'm doing something wrong. Their pursuit of happiness is less important than somebody who's born into a poorer family. And I think that is outrageous. I think that each individual's life matters to him and to the people that he loves and cares about, and we should each be free to make the most of it. The idea of holding some people down, even if it's allegedly justified by lifting some people up, I think the least you can say about it is that has nothing to do with the American ideal of unlimited opportunity.
Is there some country that you think does better than the United States? Here you've outlined a program for us. Is there some country that's followed it and that's had more economic growth?
I mean, overall, I still think we have been the most, productive and the greatest and most free nation overall. I think certainly there's things in other countries that are better. I think in certain ways there's more economic freedom in Hong Kong today than there is in America. I think, as I mentioned with the regulatory side of things, I think there's more economic freedom in some ways in Scandinavia than there is in America. But I still think that overall, this is the country that has, the greatest wealth, the greatest amount of pent-up opportunity, and at the root, a love of opportunity. Living in an opportunity-rich society is not easy because you aren't entitled to anything. You do have to take responsibility. You aren't guaranteed that job for life, so you always have to be learning and trying and really going out there and giving it your all to make something of your life. And a lot of people in this world, a lot of people in this country, but thankfully not a majority, they don't want that. They want to be taken care of. They want security. But that kind of security only comes at the expense of other people. So if we want a society where everybody has unlimited opportunity to make the most of their lives, well, here's the place to fight for it, because here's really where you have that kind of sense of life, emotional, cultural commitment to the idea of the self-made man and of the independent individual who's rising by merit and ability. So we can learn a lot from the other countries, but at the end of the day, I think there's something special about America that we should really be fighting to build on.
Well, I certainly agree with that, Don, and everybody should read Equal is Unfair and get the different perspective on inequality that you don't get from the press today. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.